All right, I will say good morning. Good morning, good morning. Let us begin. I want to begin by thanking our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Shvat. To thank the Elbaum family for dedicating all the shiurim and drushas this month in memory of Yaakov Koppel, Ben Avram Menachem Zichron Livracha, Jerry Elbaum. May his memory be a blessing and remain eternal in our hearts, dedicated by his beloved family. To thank Bracha Strimber, our Talmud Torah sponsor for the month of Shvat, for dedicating the shir, for all the shir midrashos this month in loving memory of her husband Avi Avram ben Kalman Eliezer Halevi, Zichron Livracha, on the occasion of his 9th yahrzeit. We hope that on the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an aliyah and the family a nechama. And a special thank you to Greg and Rachel Levitan for dedicating the shir this morning. A mazel tov to Greg and Rachel on the birth of a baby boy to their daughter Sarah and son-in-law Chesky Schwartz of Las Vegas, Nevada. We wish the Levitans incredible mazel tov. Shevi zocha legadol leTorah lechuppah l'maisim tovim ulachniso beviso shel Avram Avinu bizmano. Mazel tov. All right, so we'll say with that, let us begin. So a lot to do today, Baruch Hashem. We're beginning a brand new parak, really fascinating Gemara. So I just want to point out to you something very interesting. I mentioned at the end of yesterday's shir that at the end of the fourth parak you have all of these what we call Seder v'Hilchos Karban Pesach Rishon B'Kitzara. Right? So you have all of these halachos of Pesach Rishon, what we call Pesach Mitzrayim, versus Pesach Doros, which is just very interesting, right? Two different observances of Pesach, and the first Pesach of Mitzrayim was a very different kind of Pesach than the Pesach that we observe contemporarily. So I just want to point out that in Eretz Hashem now we're going to transition a lot into talking about what Pesach was like in the times of the Beis Hamikdash. So it's really quite beautiful. So we're going to begin with a discussion just about the schedule. How did the schedule for Erev Pesach look in general? So the Gemara says as follows. It's really quite amazing. So it says the Gemara, says the Mishnah, Tamid nishchat b'shmona sara mechza. We'll say in general the Karban Tamid, this is just talking about a regular day. Remember again, Karban Tamid, every day there were two Tamidin that were offered. There was the Tamid Shal Shachar, Tamid Shal Bein Ha'arbayim, morning offering, afternoon offering, and it was offered at 8.5 hours into the day. And again, we'll see exactly where these times come from as we continue along in Eretz Hashem in the parak. So Tamim nishchat b'shmona umechza, the karev b'tisha umechza. So ultimately, again, the tamid is offered up at 8.5 hours into the day, and is slaughtered at 8.5 hours, and is offered up on the mizbeach at 9.5 hours. Okay. Ba'arvi Pesachim. What about Erev Pesach? Now, Boss says you're going to see Erev Pesach is going to be a little bit more complicated. If you look at Rashi says Arvi Pesachim mekadmin le mishum deboy leme avid Pesach acharav. So Boss says we're going to see again, and we'll discuss the reasons for all of this. But halacha l'maisa, on a regular day, the Tamid Shal Bein Arbaim, the afternoon Tamid, was the last Karban which was offered. It was the last thing that went on the Mizbeach. On Erev Pesach, the Karban Pesach was offered up after the Tamid. So normally, again, you would essentially try to do the Tamid as late in the afternoon as you could, so as to give time for the rest of the Karbanos. But Erev Pesach, they bumped up, they moved up the offering of the Karban Tamid. Ba'arvi Pesachim nishchat b'sheva umechza. On Erev Pesach, the Tamid was shechted at 7.5 hours into the day. The karev b'shmona umechza, and ultimately it was offered up on the mizbeach at 8.5 hours into the day. Bein bechal, bein b'shabbos. And this is true whether Erev Pesach fell out on a weekday, whether Erev Pesach fell out on a Shabbos. This was the time. So both say, so part one, on a normal day in the Beis Hamikdash, the Karban Tamid is shechted at 8.5 hours into the day and offered up on the Mizbeach at 9.5 hours into the day. On Erev Pesach, whether Erev Pesach falls out on a regular day or on a Shabbos, everything is moved back an hour. When I say moved back, moved an hour earlier. So the Tamid is shechted at 7.5 hours into the day and ultimately offered up on the Mizbeach at 8.5 hours into the day. What happens? Chal Erev Pesach lios be'erev Shabbos. What happens if Erev Pesach falls out on Erev Shabbos. He will say, so it's interesting. For us, sometimes the most quote-unquote hectic thing is when Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos, right? For us, because then there's the whole Bir Chametz issue. In the Beis Hamikdash, interestingly enough, the most complicated day is when Erev Pesach falls out on Erev Shabbos. We'll say, why is that? Because remember again, there, halacha l'maaseh, right? So the Seder, you're going to eat your Karban Pesach on Shabbos night. The problem is, remember, the roasting of the Karban Pesach is not Docha Shabbos, which means you have to be finished with the slaughtering and cooking of Karban Pesach before Shabbos starts. So that's the most complicated day. So it's interesting. If Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos, it's pretty simple. Because what's the halacha? We'll see all of this. You shech the Karban Pesach on Shabbos, you just don't roast it until nightfall. But l'maaseh, again, when Erev Pesach falls out on Erev Shabbos, that's the most complicated day. When I say complicated, there's a solution for everything. But that's when the timeline becomes most stretched. So watch this. Erev Pesach lios Erev Shabbos, nishchat b'sheishu mechza, v'karev b'shevo mechza. Then the tamid is shechted at 6.5 hours into the day, and ultimately again offered up at 7.5 hours into the day. V'ha Pesach acharav. And then the Karban Pesach is offered after. So therefore, I will say 3 time frames. On a normal day, you're going to see this discussion is focused on the Karban tamid, because normally, again, without Pesach, the tamid itself is the sacrificial bookend, right? You begin the day with the Karban tamid, you end the sacrificial day with the Karban tamid. Karban Pesach is unique in that it's offered up after the Karban tamid. So on a regular day, you're shechting the tamid at 8.5 hours, offering it up at 9.5 hours. When on Erev Pesach, you're moving it forward an hour, slaughtering it at 7.5 hours, and offering it up at 8.5 hours. When Erev Pesach falls on Erev Shabbos, and again, look at Rashi just a moment. Chal Erev Pesach Erev Shabbos, bo'ina lak dumei tvei. You have to offer up the tamid even earlier. Mishum de boi lishchot Pesach acharav ulitzloso mi ba'od yom. Rashi says over, not only do you have to offer up the Karban Pesach before Shabbos, you have to roast it before Shabbos. So when Erev Pesach falls out on Erev Shabbos, we move the tamid to 6.5 hours into the day, or slaughter it at 6.5, offer it up at 7.5, and Karban Pesach after. So we'll say those are the 3 time frames for Karban tamid. Good, or at least for now. We'll say, how do I know that on a general day? Let's start with just the simple, straightforward halacha. That on a general day, the Karban tamid is offered up at 8.5 hours. Let me be more specific. That the Karban tamid is shechted at 8.5 hours and offered up on the mizbeach at 9.5 hours. Where do I know that from? Amar Rabbi Shimon Levi Damar Kra. Es hakeves echad ta'aseh b'boker, v'eis hakeves hasheni ta'aseh ben ha'arbayim. So this is actually very interesting. So the pasuk says by Karban tamid, 1 keves you should do in the boker, you should do in the morning, and the second keves ta'aseh ben ha'arbayim. You should offer it up ben ha'arbayim. Now both say, what does ben ha'arbayim mean? So listen to this. Chalkeu lebein shnei aravim. You should go ahead and offer it up between the 2 parts of the afternoon. Now both say, remember, let's say on a perfect day, when sunrise is 6 and sunset is 6, so the afternoon is 6 hours. The afternoon is 6 hours. In general, the way halacha works, afternoon is 6 hours. The day is always going to be 12 hours. 6 hours of that are quote-unquote morning. 6 hours of that are afternoon. So the afternoon is 6 hours. The Torah says, when do you offer up the tamid shal ben arbayim, or the afternoon tamid ben arbayim, in between the afternoons? So the way the Gemara understands that is, offer it up in the middle of the 2 parts of the afternoon. Now watch this. So what do? The Gemara says, Chalkeu lebein shnei aravim, bein shos umechza lekan, shtei shos umechza lekan, v'sha achas lasiyaso. So what happens? So essentially, you need 1 hour for the tamid. So go ahead and essentially work back 2.5 hours, work forward from the beginning of the afternoon 2.5 hours. And I will say, so think about this. The afternoon begins at the 6th hour of the day. So 2.5 hours in is what time? 8.5 hours into the day. So essentially you off that, and that's the middle of the afternoons. So 8.5 hours into the day, recognizing that you need an hour for the Karban tamid. So from hour 8.5 to hour 9.5, that's bein ha'arbayim. That's sandwiched in between 2.5 hour increments of the afternoon. Fascinating. So the Gemara says, Masiv Rava raised the kasha, Ba'arvei Pesachim nishchat b'sheva mechza, u'krav b'shmono mechza. Okay, so let's analyze this. And now I understand, you're telling me that the timing of the Karban Pesach is learned out from a pasuk in the Torah. Bein ha'arbayim, you offer up the afternoon. Tamid, ultimately, again, in between the two chalokim of the afternoon. Fine. Let's now go back to the Mishnah. Rava says, on Erev Pesach, remember again, quick review. Erev Pesach, when do you offer up the Tamid? Quick. 7.5 hours. 7.5 hours, right? You move it back. They will say, remember again, this is Erev Pesach that falls on a weekday or on a Shabbos. So you move it back, you're going to offer up the Tamid at 7.5 hours. So massive Rava, I don't understand. We saw in the Mishnah that when Erev Pesach falls out on a weekday or on Shabbos, you offer up the Tamid at 7, you shecht the Tamid at 7.5 hours and offer it up at 8.5 hours. I don't understand. I don't understand. If the timing for the Tamid is midda oraisa. In other words, if you're telling me that you are learning out the timing of the Tamid at 8.5 hours from the phrase bein ha'arbayim, then what? What's the kasha? How can you move it? That should be an immutable biblical law. What are you changing it? Amar Rava, therefore, Rava reframes this. He says no. Mitzvah so the Tamid mishina to tzlale erev. In reality, the mitzvah to offer up the Tamid, it's from the time that the afternoon shadows begin to appear. In other words, we'll say, remember, when the sun is directly overhead at 6 hours, so there's no side shadows. It's only once the sun begins to gravitate towards the west that there's what we call an afternoon shadow. Which is another way of saying the timing for the Tamid ultimately again begins at 6.5 hours into the day. That's the earliest time that you could offer up the Tamid bein ha'arbayim. So mitzvaso the Tamid misheyinatu tzlali arev. So ultimately again the Tamid could be offered when we'll call it the western shadows begin to be cast. My time of the Amakra bein ha'arbayim. Me'idna demaschil shimsha leme'arav. From the time that the sun begins to move westward, which is 6.5 hours into the day and on, that's when you could go ahead and offer up Tamid. So we'll say, so I want to point out over here, it's fascinating because Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi and Rava are arguing on how to darshan the pasuk bein ha'arbayim. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says bein ha'arbayim means in between the two parts of the afternoon. 2 parts of the afternoon, right? There's 2.5 hours on the back end, 2.5 hours on the front end. That puts you right at hour 8.5. You have an hour to shecht and to offer up. Rava says the problem with that is you're locking yourself into a specific hour for Karban Tamid. And if that's really how you darshan the pasuk, then what license do you have to go ahead and move the zman anytime during the year? Therefore, Rava comes along and says, no, bein ha'arbayim means from the time that the sun begins to gravitate westward, right? Arav, westward. Marav, westward. So therefore, we'll say bein ha'arbayim means Marav, right? The time the sun begins to gravitate, which is when? 6.5 hours into the day and on. Hilchach. Therefore, again, watch this. Supposed to listen to this. Therefore, during the rest of the year, when we say during the rest of the year, meaning not Erev Pesach, when Rabbi say that people bring karbanos, right, on any given day, they're ultimately, again, we're people who are bringing own personal offerings. Rabbi says, as we said before, and we'll discuss where this is from, the Karban Tamid was the last Karban brought. The Karban Tamid shall be in Arbayim. The afternoon Tamid usually was the last Karban brought. Erev Pesach is the exception. So on a regular day, you want to give people time to bring their personal offerings. Dika nadarim unedavas derachmana amar. Allah chalvi ashlamim. The pasuk says, Allah chalvi ashlamim. If you look at Rashi says, Allah chalvi ashlamim. Ala tamid shal shachar hashlim kala karbanos velo tashlimim al tamid ha'erev. Dila'achar tamid shal erev lo sakriv karban. So we'll listen to this. So again, we're going to dash in this pasuk a bit more explicitly in a bit. But when it comes to the tamid shal shachar, right? The Karban Tamid, the morning Tamid, the Torah says, Aleha chelve hashlamim. Now, literally what it means is, on it, the fats of the shlamim. The way the Gemara is dashing it is, Aleha, on the Tamid shel shachar, Hashleim. Finish up the other karbanos. In other words, we're going to see the morning tamid was the first offering which could be offered in the Beis HaMikdash. So after you offer the morning tamid, bring everything else you want to. But the afternoon tamid is the close. V'amar mar, aleh achal ve'aleh hashleim kol hakarbanos kulon ma'acharin alei. I'm sorry, aleh hashleim kol hakarbanos kulon. So therefore, I will say, ultimately, the pasuk says that halacha lemaisa, it's on the morning tamid that we go ahead and we offer all of our karbanos afterwards. But the afternoon tamid is the close of sacrificial service for the day. Therefore, ma'acharinon le tarti shoy v'avdina le bishmona umechza. Therefore, I will say, on a regular day, I'm going to put, even though I could offer up the tamid shel ben arbaim, the afternoon tamid, when could I offer it up? When could I offer it up? 6.5 hours into the day. But I don't want to do that. Why don't I want to do that? Because again, I want to give time for people to bring their individual sacrifices. Therefore, on a regular day, I push the Tamid Shal Bein Ha'arbayim off 2 hours. 2 hours. Now, I will say, remember, according to Rava, you could do this. Why? Because what does Bein Ha'arbayim mean according to Rava? What does it mean? From the time that the sun begins to move westward, which doesn't lock in. See, according to Rabbi Shua ben Levi's interpretation, Bein Ha'arbayim actually locks the Tamid into one specific hour, into the hour 8.5 to 9.5. According to Rava, Bein Ha'arbayim just means you could offer the Tamid from the time that the sun begins to move westward, which gives you the entire afternoon to offer up the Tamid. So there's flexibility. So on a regular day, I'm going to wait. On a regular day, I'm going to wait to offer it up until 8.5 hours into the day to give people time to offer up their personal karbanos. So machrina le tarti shoy v'avdin le b'shmona mechza ba'arvei pesachim. Therefore, on erev Pesach, the ika Pesach acharav. But also on erev Pesach, when I have to offer up the carbon Pesach after the tamid, then what? Chadzmina le sha'achas. We'll move the tamid back 1 hour, so I'll offer up the tamid at 7.5 hours. When I say offer, meaning we'll shecht it, we'll do the tamid at 7.5 hours. Va'avdina le b'sheva umechza chal erev Pesach lios b'Shabbos. But when Erev Pesach falls out on Erev Shabbos, which again, remember, is more complicated, not because of the offering of the Pesach, but what? Because of the roasting of the Pesach. Remember again, when Erev Pesach falls out on Erev Shabbos, everything, the shechita and cooking and roasting of the Korban Pesach has to be done before the onset of Shabbos. Dikinam itzliya, so I have to roast the Pesach. Also, the lo dachi Shabbos, because the roasting of the Pesach does not set aside Shabbos. Mukmina le adine b'sheshu mechza. We move back the carbon tamid to its earliest time, which is 6.5 hours into the day. So I will say, this is the dramatic position of Rava. So first of all, let's work our way through it. So Rava says, Bein Ha'arbayim teaches me that the carbon tamid could be offered up as of when the sun begins to move westward. When does the sun begin to move westward? 6.5 hours into the day. On a regular day, but remember, keeping in mind that under normal circumstances, the tamid shall be the afternoon tamid is the last carbon offered for the day. That closes out sacrificial service of the day. So therefore, on a regular day, we offer up the carbon tamid when? At 8.5 hours into the day. Because what does that do? That gives people time. All the hours between the morning tamid and the afternoon tamid is all open for personal offering. So on a regular day, we'll offer up tamid at 8.5 hours into the day. Good. Erev Pesach, when Erev Pesach falls out on a weekday or on Shabbos, we'll move back the tamid for an hour. Right? We'll do it at 7.5 hours. Because remember, the carbon Pesach is offered up after the tamid. When Erev Pesach was, by the way, we don't know why that is yet, right? Remember, we know that as a fact, but we have not yet seen the reason for that. But when Erev Pesach falls out on Erev Shabbos, where not only do you have to go ahead and shech the carbon Pesach, but you also have to roast it, we'll move the carbon tamid back to its earliest possible time, which is 6.5 hours into the day. Good, Abosai. That is the position of Rava, and remember, that's supported by the Mishnah. But the beauty of Rava's interpretation of Abosai is that his understanding of Bein Ha'arbayim allows for what? Carbon tamid flexibility. That's the whole chap over here. The problem with Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi's approach was carbon tamid rigidity. If you're saying Bein Ha'arbayim is between the two parts of the afternoon, that locks you into 1 hour. According to Rava, you have much more flexibility. Beautiful. Ton Rabbanon, Kisidura b'chol kach sidura b'Shabbos tiv Rabbi Yishmael. So ultimately, again, the Gemara says, the same way that the Tamid was offered up during the week is the same way it was offered up on Shabbos. These are the words of Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Akiva Omer, supposed to say now, we're just solely focusing now on Tamid. So again, you have Rabbi Yishmael saying, the process of the Tamid on Shabbos and weekday were exactly the same. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Kisiduro be'erev Pesach. No, just like it was arranged on Erev Pesach. Okay, my comment, what does that mean? That what it sounds like what he's saying is that the Tamid on Shabbos was the same way as the Tamid on Erev Pesach. My kamar, by Hachi kamar. Kisiduro bichol be'erev Pesach. The same way that the Tamid was offered during Erev Pesach, which fell on a weekday. Kach siduro b'Shabbos. So was it offered up on Shabbos. I will say, now remember again, based on what we learned, how was the Tamid offered up on Erev Pesach that fell out on a weekday? When was it offered? 7.5 hours into the day. So it sounds like what the Gemara is saying over here is the same way that the Tamid was offered up at 7.5 hours on Erev Pesach that fell on a weekday, so too Karban Tamid is offered up at 7.5 hours on Shabbos. Kach sidura be'erev Shabbos, b'Shabbos. So the Gemara says, Kach sidura b'Shabbos be'erev HaPesach. This is the same way that it's offered up on Shabbos on Erev Pesach. Divrei Yishmael. So okay, boss. So now we're gonna straighten this out in just a moment. So Kach sidura b'Shabbos be'erev HaPesach. This is the way it would also have been arranged on Shabbos, that is Erev Pesach. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Kiva Omer, Kisiduro be'erev HaPesach shechalios be'erev Shabbos, the same way that Karban Pesach was offered up on Erev Pesach that fell on Erev Shabbos, which again, at least according to the Mishnah, is at what time? 6.5 hours into the day. Kach siduro b'Shabbos. This is how it was offered up on Shabbos as well. Umas nisin diktoni bein b'chol bein b'Shabbos, and our Mishnah ultimately, again, which said, this is how it's offered up. Bein b'chol, bein b'Shabbos. And Erev Pesach falls out both on a weekday and on Shabbos. Rabbi Yishmael. Ultimately, again, this would reflect the view of Rabbi Yishmael as we just said. So, my comment will say, what are they arguing about? So, listen to this. This is actually very interesting. So, we'll say, Rabbi Yishmael holds, Musafin Kodmin Labazichin. So, we'll say, remember again, we're getting introduced to a couple of facets. Again, we're gonna see, I promise you, by the end of this, we're gonna have a solid timeline in the Beis HaMikdash. So, Rabbi Yishmael holds like this, that on Shabbos, the Karban Musaf was offered up before the Bazichin. But see, remember again, on Shabbos, one of the interesting things that happened was the Lechem HaPanim, right, the showbread, was removed from the Shulchan and given to the group of Kohanim who had finished their week of service. So they would take off the lechem, I don't want to call it the old lechem hapanim, because the miracle was lechem hapanim remained fresh. They took off last week's lechem hapanim, and they replaced it with brand new lechem hapanim. Now when they switched the lechem hapanim off the table, there were 2 spoons of levona, frankincense, that were on the shulchan. They would offer those up on the mizbeach. So the machlokes is as follows. Rabbi Yishmael Savar, Musafin Kodmin Labazichin. Rabbi Yishmael holds that the Karban Musaf of Shabbos had to be offered up before the Bazichin. Therefore, Avidu Musafin B'Sheish, they would offer up on Shabbos. They would offer up the Karban Musaf at 6 hours. Bazichin B'Sheva, the spoons of frankincense at 7 hours. Va'avid leila tamid b'sheva umechza, and they would offer up the tamid at 7.5 hours into the day. They both say this is just a regular Shabbos. This is just a regular Shabbos. According to Rabbi Yishmael, Musaf at 6, Bazichin at 7, Karban tamid at 7.5. Rabbi Akiva Savar, no, Bazichin Kodmin lemusafin. Rabbi Akiva felt that the Bazichin, the levona, the frankincense, was offered up before the Musaf. Therefore, Bazichin b'chamish, the Bazichin were offered up at hour number 5. Musafin b'sheish, va'avid leitamid b'sheish umechz. And the tamid was done at 6.5 hours. I will say, now remember, when was the only other time that the tamid was done at 6.5 hours into the day? When? Erev Pesach, that falls out on Erev Shabbos. So therefore, again, I will say that was the lashon, that every Shabbos is like Erev Pesach that falls out on Erev Shabbos. So I will say this is the machlokes Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva, the timeline for Shabbos day in the Beis HaMikdash. So according to Rabbi Yishmael, Musaf at 6, Musaf at 6, Bazichin at 7, Tamid at 7.5. Rabbi Akiva, Bazichin at 5, Musaf at 6, Tamid at 6.5. Maskif Rava, Midi Rabbi Akiva, Kisiduro be'erev Pesach Chalios be'erev Shabbos Katani. But that's not what Rabbi Akiva said. The Rabbi Akiva say that the Tamid on Shabbos is like the Tamid on Erev Pesach that falls out on Erev Shabbos. Kisiduro be'erev Pesach Stama Katani. All Rabbi Akiva said was that the offering of the Tamid on Shabbos is like the offering of the Tamid on Erev Pesach. He doesn't say Erev Pesach that falls out on Erev Shabbos. Ela Amar Rava. Hachi Kamar. The Rava said this is what we have to say. Kisiduro b'chol da'alma, kach siduro b'shabes be'erev ha'pesach. That ultimately, and I will say that Rava says like this. Rabbi Akiva means to say is the same way that the Karban Tamid was done during the week. This is the way it was done on Shabbos, which is Erev Pesach. Div Rabbi Yishmael. These words Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Kisiduro be'erev ha'Pesach. Rabbi Akiva says no, that the way it was done on Shabbos was the way it was done on Erev Pesach. Umasnisin diktani bein b'chol bein b'Shabbos. When the Mishnah says that when Erev Pesach falls out, whether on Chol or on Shabbos, we just move it back to 7.5 hours. Rabbi Akiva, he reflects the view of Rabbi Akiva. Good. But my kamifligir, so what are they arguing about? B'michmar basar kamifligir. This is very interesting. What they argue about is the spoilage of meat. Spoilage of meat. Do we have to be concerned with some level of spoilage? In other words, I will say, if we go ahead and we push the tamid too early, do we have to be concerned with any level of spoilage? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yishmael savar chayshinu lemichmar bisra. Rabbi Yishmael says we have to be concerned, ultimately again, with some level of spoilage. We'll say if you take a look at Rashi, it's the last Rashi in the Daf. Lo chayshin lemichmar bisra chimum habasar. Chimum habasar. Good. So Rabbi Shmuel says we're concerned with spoilage. Rabbi Akiva says lo chayshin lemichmar bisra. Rabbi Akiva says we're not concerned with spoilage at all. Amud beis. Ilo chayshinan. But if that's the case that we're not concerned with spoilage at all, then ne'avde b'sheishu mechza. Then why not go ahead and just do the Karban Tamid at 6.5 hours into the day? Kasavar, because he holds Musafin Koldmin Lebazichin. Ultimately, again, that the Karban Musaf has to occur before the Bazichin, before the offering of the frankincense. I saw Avid Lahu Musafin B'Sheish, Ubazichin B'Sheva, Va'avid Lahu Tamid B'Sheva Umechza. So ultimately, again, he holds that the Musaf has to be done before the Bazichin, and therefore, again, do the Musaf at 7, Musaf at 6, Bazichin at 7, and do the Tamid at 7.5. Maskif la Rava bar Ula, Midei ki Sidura b'chol kach Sidura b'Shabbos b'erev Pesach. So ultimately, again, Rava says as follows. Maskif la Rava bar Ula, Midei ki Sidura b'chol kach Sidura b'Shabbos b'erev Pesach. Tirei b'Shmuel Katani. Does it say that the way it's arranged during the week, this is the way that it's arranged on Shabbos Erev Pesach? These are Rabbi Shmuel. No, it says Kach Siduro b'Shabbos Stama Katani. But say all the Gemara is just picking up on right now is the verbiage employed by the Braisa when espousing the particular shita ultimately of Rabbi Shmuel. Ela Amar Rabba Bar Ula Hachi Katani. This is what it means to say Kisiduro b'chol da'alma. The same way that the Karban Tamid is offered up during the week in general. Kach Siduro b'Shabbos da'alma de Rabbi Shmuel. This is the way that it's done on Shabbos. According to Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Akiva Omer no kisidura be'erev Pesach, that Shabbos resembles erev Pesach, a stam erev Pesach. We'll say not an erev Pesach that falls out on erev Shabbos, but a regular erev Pesach. Where what? Let me get according to our Mishnah. What time do you offer up the Talmud on a regular erev Pesach? 7.5 hours into the day. The Gemara says as follows. Kach Siduro Rabbi Kiva Omer Kisiduro be'erev Pesach da'alma. Kach Siduro b'Shabbos da'alma. Umas nisan diktani bein b'chol bein b'Shabbos divrei hakolki. And the Mishnah that says that ultimately, again, when erev Pesach falls out, whether on a weekday or on Shabbos, we move it back to hour number 7.5. That reflects the view of everyone. So the Gemara says, so what did Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel argue about? B'gzeras nedarim unedavas kamiflagi. We'll say ultimately, again, what they worry about is what we call the gzera of nedarim and nedavas. We'll say, what does this mean? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Shmuel Savar Gazrinan Shabbos atuchol. Rabbi Akiva savar lo gazrinan. So Rabbi Yishmael says that we're concerned that ultimately, again, what happens on Shabbos may lead you to go ahead and, we'll take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Rashi says, Kol Shabbosos Hashano Nishchat B'Sheva Mechza. No, I'm sorry. No, sorry, no Rashi here. Fine. So good. We'll go. Rabbi Yishmael holds, Gazin and Shabbos Atuchol. Rabbi Yishmael says we're concerned, ultimately, again, that how you conduct yourself on Shabbos ultimately will influence what happens during the week. Rabbi Akiva Savar, Lo Gazinon. And Rabbi Akiva holds that we're not gozer. Fine. Ilo Gazinon, Ne'avde Bevav Umechza. But if you're not concerned, then why not offer up the Tamid at 6.5 hours into the day? Kasavar Musaf and Koldmin Labazichin. Ultimately, again, because he holds that the Musaf, Karban Musaf on Shabbos, has to occur before the Bazichin, before the frankincense. Therefore, again, Musafin B'Sheish, Ubazichin B'Zayin, Va'aved Leila Tamid B'Zayin Umechza. And ultimately, again, so therefore, in his timeline, the Musaf will be at 6 hours, the Bazichin at 7 hours, and we offer up the Talmud at 7.5 hours. So both say, let's just go a little bit weiter, and then I'm going to give you the Rambam with the entire timeline, which Mir Hashem will allow all of this to come together. So the Gemara says as follows: Meisvei, raise the kasha. What I want to do, there's a Tosas here also. Fine. Just look at one Rashi, then we'll go on. Look at Rashi Kach Siduro. Rashi says, B'Shabbosu shekol hashana, v'af agav deleken adar menadavas chashinu l'srach nedarim dechol, dilma asu l'misrach u'leme'aved b'chol nami b'sheva, u'mifsli nedar menadavas sha'achar. So what I want to point out over here is, in this last version, the machlokus in Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva is a concern that if we go ahead and we move the Karban Tamid early on Shabbos. Now remember again, moving the Karban Tamid, let me just clarify this one point and then we'll move on. On a regular day, right, besides Erev Pesach, so Tamid Shabbein Harbayim is the last Karban which is offered. Remember again, the exception to that is Erev Pesach, where the Pesach is offered up after the Tamid. The concern in general with moving the Karban Pesach, with moving the Tamid early, is what? Is a concern that Lamaisa, that means you're going to be offering up Nadarim and Nadavas earlier as well, the potential for spoilage. So interestingly enough, now on Shabbos, remember, there are no Nadarim and Nadavas that are offered up. You can't offer up personal Kabbalos on Shabbos. So moving the Tamid earlier on Shabbos does not really create an issue or a potential issue of spoilage. The shaila would become, would we be concerned that what you do on Shabbos may ultimately, again, influence what happens during the week? That was the machlokes Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael in the last iteration. Let's do one more piece, then we'll see the Rambam. Meisvei, Tamid shal kol hashana kula karav kil chaso. The Tamid throughout the entire year is offered up in the normal way. Nishchat b'shmona, it's shechted in the 8th hour, shmono mechza, the karav b'tesu mechza, and is offered up in the 9.5 hour. Ube erev Pesach, on Erev Pesach was moved back 1 hour. Nishchat b'shevel mechza, the kari b'chasu mechza. So we'll say, so far nothing new. Our Mishnah. Chalios b'Shabbos. What happens if Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos? Chalios b'Shabbos kichol. Right, so ultimately, again, it's this. Chalios b'Shabbos, kichalios b'sheni b'Shabbos. So ultimately, again, let me read that once more. So what happens? So remember, in this, so Tamid, the regular Tamid offered up at 8.5 hours, and shechted 8.5, offered up 9.5. Erev Pesach, it shechted at 7.5, and offered up at 8.5. Chalios b'Shabbos. What happens if Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos? According to Rabbi Yishmael, kichal lihios b'sheni b'Shabbos. According to Rabbi Yishmael, Erev Pesach falling out on Shabbos is no different than falling out on a Monday. Which will say, meaning it's no different than falling out on any day. There's no distinction if Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos, or if Erev Pesach ultimately falls out on a weekday. What we do on a regular day is, Tamid offered up at 8.5 hours into the day. On Erev Pesach, it's 7.5 hours into the day, and it makes no difference when Erev Pesach falls out. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Kisiduro be'erev Pesach. Rabbi Akiva says that no, we go ahead and we perform it like Erev Pesach. So the Gemara says, okay, what does that mean? So remember again, according to Rabbi Yishmael, if Erev Pesach falls out, Chalios b'Shabbos, so Rabbi Yishmael holds Erev Pesach on Shabbos is no different than Erev Pesach on a Monday. Rabbi Akiva says, Kisiduro be'erev ha-Pesach. So says the Gemara, Bishlam la'abaye necha. According to Abaye, ultimately, again, this statement makes sense. A little of a kashya, but according to Rava's interpretation, it'll be difficult. Amalacha Rava, no. Lo tema kichal b'sheni b'Shabbos. Rava said, don't read Rabbi Shmuel as saying it's as if that when Erev Pesach falls out on a Shabbos, it's as if it fell out on a Monday. Ela ima kisheni b'Shabbos da'alma. Rather say, it's just like a regular Monday. In other words, we'll say what it sounds like. Look at Rashi. Ela'ima kisheni b'Shabbos, right across from Rashi. Sha'ena erev Pesach ta'hainu b'shmono mechza techashinu lemichmar bisra. So we'll say what it sounds like that according to Rabbi Shah is actually saying is that halacha l'maisa you would not move back the tamid on erev Pesach at all. Meisvei, so the Gemara raises the kasha chalios b'Shabbos. If Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos, Kisiduro kol hashana kula ol divrei b'shmo. So if Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos, it's done the same way like the Talmud is done throughout the year. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Kisiduro be'erev ha-Pesach. That ultimately, again, it's like a regular Erev Pesach, da'alma. Bishlam al Rava necha ela Abaye kasha. So according to Rava's interpretation, the statement makes sense. But according to Abaye, it's a kasha. Abaye would say, Lo tema kisidura kol hashana. Don't say that you offer up the tamid like you do throughout the year. Ela ima kisidura kol hashanim kulon. Don't say that you offer up the tamid like you do throughout the year. Rashi says, Kiseder kol hashana hainu b'shmono mechza dechashin l'michmar bisra. Rather read it, Ela ima kisidura kol hashanim. Rather say it like we do throughout the years. Divrei B'Shabbat. So what does that mean? Kol Hashanim. She'erev, Rashi says Kol Hashanim. She'erev Pesach chal b'chol. When Erev Pesach falls out on a weekday, Tishachtinu b'shava u'mechza. That we would normally move back the Tamid by an hour. Slaughter it, that's 7.5 hours. Rabbi Akiva Amar, Kisidura Erev Pesach shechalios Erev Shabbos. Whereas Rabbi Akiva Amar, Kisidura Erev Pesach shechalios Erev Shabbos. Rabbi Akiva says that no, the order of it would be like an Erev Pesach that falls out on an Erev Shabbos, which also would mean ultimately moving the Tamid back to 6.5 hours. Okay, let's take a breath now for a second. So now we have a lot of information, right? A lot of information. Namely, again, we have a number of different models. Model number one is Karban Tamid on a regular day. So again, seems to be everybody's that doesn't seem to be a point of contention. Karban Tamid on a regular day offered up when? Is going to be offered up at 6.5 hours into the day. After that, now the Gemara introduces us to the Machlokes Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael, which then has Shabbos ramifications, then has ultimately, again, Erev Pesach ramifications as well. But we said, let me read to you the Rambam. So before we said, because again, we're going to start, not a new sugya, but a little bit of a different term, but let's just get clarity on the timeline. So the Rambam, in Hilchos Tamidin Umusafin, Parak Aleph Halacha Gimel writes as follows. Tamid Shalbein Arbaim, Shochtin oso misheyarich hatzel v'yukal kol sherich. You offer up the Karban Tamid when the shade literally means the shade becomes longer. What does that mean? I will say when v'hu mishesh sha'os umechza umaylat safayom. So I will say we paskin just point number one. Because remember again we had a machlokes between Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi and Rava. And what was the machlokes? How do you translate the words? Bein ha'arbayim, right? Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi had a very specific translation between the two chalakim of the afternoon, 2.5 hours on the front end, 2.5 hours on the back end, which really limits the Talmud Shal Bein Ha'arbayim to the hour 8.5, right? So we reject that halacha l'maisa. We interpret Rava's interpretations. Bein ha'arbayim actually means at the time that the sun begins to move westward. So therefore, that's how the Rambam paskins. So therefore, there's a range. You could begin to offer up the Talmud Shal Bein Ha'arbayim at 6.5 hours into the day, all the way until the end of the afternoon. Listen to this. V'lo hayu shochtin osa b'chol yom ela b'shmona shosa mechza. The Karban Tisha, on a regular day, I will say that here we go. You can take your notes now. Your halacha l'maisa. So number one, we paskin like the interpretation of Rava. That's Aleph. Therefore, the earliest time to offer up the Talmud Shal Bein Ha'arbayim is 6.5 hours into the day. On a regular day in the Beis HaMikdash, what did they do? They offered up at 8.5 hours. When I say offered up, meaning they shechted it at 8.5 hours, and put it on the Mizbeach at 9.5 hours. That is a regular day in the Beis HaMikdash. So the Gemara says, so Rambam says, v'lama ma'acherin also shtei sha'os achar tchilas man shich. So, but why do you delay it 2 hours, right? Because remember, if you could offer it up at 6.5 hours, why do you delay it until 8.5? Very simple. Mipnei karbano shekol yichidim shel tzibur lefi sha'aser lahakriv karban klal kodim tamid shel shachar v'lo shochat in karban acher tamid shel bein ha'arbaim chutz karban pesach levado she'ef sheyakriv v'sobas. Very simple. If you could offer it up at 6.5 hours, reason makdim in the mitzvahs, why not offer up the tamid at 6.5 hours? Very simple. Nothing could be offered up before the tamid shel shachar, and nothing could be offered up after the Tamid Shal Bein Ha'arbayim. That's your sacrificial window. Therefore, they would delay the offering of the Tamid Shal Bein Ha'arbayim until 8.5 hours into the day. They would shecht it at 8.5, offer it up on the Mizbeach at 9.5, and that was the close of sacrificial service. Okay. Next, says the Rambam. But what about Erev Pesach? Okay, drum roll, right? What about Erev Pesach? Right, so what happens now? So we'll say, great, that's a regular day. Regularly in the English, we're solid on the timeline. What about Erev Pesach? Watch this. Erev Pesach, Bein B'chol, Bein B'Shabbos. Right, so category number one is if Erev Pesach falls out, right now, whether a weekday or on Shabbos, what's the halacha? Hayatamid nishchat b'shava umechza, v'karev b'shmona umechza. So again, when Erev Pesach falls out on a weekday or on Shabbos, they just move back the Talmud 1 hour. Instead of offering it up at 8.5 hours, they offered it up at 7.5 hours. Because also, remember again, the logic is very important. Why only move it back an hour? Because we'll say, all I need time for is what? For what? Is for the shechita of the Pesach. What don't I need time for? The roasting. Because remember again, if Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos, when am I going to roast? That night. I'll roast Motzei Shabbos. Again, I'll just roast that night. There's no problem. So, and when Erev Pesach falls out, ultimately again on a weekday, I'll just roast when? Well, anytime. Right after Erev Pesach night doesn't really matter. So again, when Erev Pesach falls out either on Shabbos or on a weekday, you just move back to Talmud 1 hour. However, V'mchal Erev Pesach lios Erev Shabbos. But if Erev Pesach falls out on Erev Shabbos, so from a Beis HaMikdash perspective, this was the most complicated day, because when Erev Pesach falls out on Erev Shabbos, you not only have to offer up your Tamid, you have to get in all of the Karbanos Pesach, and you also have to what? Roast everything before the onset of Shabbos. Shochtin also b'sheish umechza betchilas zmano v'karev b'sheva umechza. So you'd offer up the Karban Pesach at 6.5 hours into the day, offer it up on the Mizbeach at 7.5 hours into the day. Kidei she'eh lam revach litzlos kodem she'ikanei Shabbos. In order that what? In order that halacha l'maisa, there should be enough time to have it roasted before the entry of Shabbos. Then Rabbi say, really what comes out is pretty much just as it was espoused in our Mishnah. You know, what's incredible is the Gemara made, I don't want to say the Gemara made this complicated, right? But the Gemara made it a little bit complicated. But again, the full circle is we pretty much come back to the Mishnah. So therefore Rabbi say, based on this, we mamish have the full timeline of the day. Now remember, what we don't know yet, and what we'll come back to it, is what we do regarding the bazichin. Right? Because we'll say, remember again, the one interesting part that we're left with over here is Shabbos and the Beis HaMikdash. So now I know I'm clear now on Karban Pesach, Karban Tamid. That piece I have, right? So again, one more time, regular day, shechted at 8.5, offered up at 9.5. Erev Pesach, Shabbos on a weekday, move it back to 7, shechted 7.5, offered up 8.5. Or Erev Pesach, Erev Shabbos, move it back to 6.5. That's the halacha l'maisa. What I still have to know is on Shabbos, number one, what is the order of offering up? Because also on Shabbos, forget about Pesach for just a moment. Shabbos, I have the issue of Bazichin, right, and Karban Musaf. So is Bazichin offered before Musaf? Is Musaf offered before Bazichin? That part we don't have resolution on, but Amir Tzom will stop over here for today, and we'll say we'll pick up with this Tan Rabbanan. So now that we have the timeline, Amir Hashem, now we'll begin to get into the logic of the different approaches. In other words, we don't know the why. How do I know that Pesach comes after Tamid, if after all you've told me that under normal circumstances, Tamid is the last carbon which is offered? So Mir Hashem, to be continued tomorrow.